Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to the show. I'm so thrilled to welcome back a tremendous guest, the great Nicole DiPaolo. We had a fantastic conversation the first time, and now we're back with a video interview, and we're going to talk about romantic era piano playing, partimento, harmony, and schema, and all the wonderful things that everybody is interested in on this channel. Nicole, welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you for having me, as always.
So we have so much to talk about, and I encourage people to go to the first interview to check it out. We covered a lot of great topics. In this interview, let's talk about the Romantic era. I mean, that is such a great era. I mean, Chopin, Schumann, Mendelssohn, Brahms. I mean, it's just all the heavy hitters. They all sound great. And but of course, it's a big question mark, right? Because we have the 18th century course. We have all the Partimenti from the 18th century. We have all these treatises. The 19th century gets a little bit not so clear. And that's why we have guests like you on to who have a lot of experience, because I've interviewed quite a few harpsichordists and they're wonderful. And to talk about early music is fantastic. But it's now good to talk to a pianist now, because that instrument really started to take off, right, Nicole, in the 19th century.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one thing I like to do with my piano students is have them look up historical instruments on YouTube when we learn which year their piece was composed. I have a student working on the Chopin G minor Ballade, and we looked up a piano from 1835. We were able to find a couple, and really, they don't sound that different from forte pianos that we would have heard in Mozart and Beethoven. So that's just one illustration of the idea that there's not such a sort of definite line between the classical practice and the romantic practice as maybe piano students are led to think there is. And so, I really got interested in this idea because I have a lot of partimento and composition students who have expressed that their interest is in learning how to write in a romantic style. And
yeah,
so that's kind of been a focus as of late, just kind of putting together the materials that would be most relevant to what their goals are. But I mean, this is a weird blurred line. I mean, Schubert was a pallbearer at Beethoven's funeral, yet we think of Beethoven as a classical composer, and a lot of people will think of Schubert as a romantic composer. If you're competing or you're auditioning, Schubert pieces tend to be sort of lumped into the romantic category, but their lives overlapped almost completely.
Well, so was there a point that Beethoven became romantic? Is there such a thing? I mean, is that called middle or late Beethoven?
Oh, I think he couldn't shake his classical tendencies ever. I don't think he wished to. Well, we can't ask him because he's dead. But even in some of these more harmonically adventurous sort of late pieces, like a Hammer Clavier, I mean, he's really kind of engaging with the classical form. I think he just liked that classical aesthetic in certain ways. So I think Beethoven would be completely fine with being lumped in as a classical period composer. On those audition lists, you're going to audition for your piano degree, and you're told you need to play a Bach Prelude and Fugue, a Beethoven Sonata, and a Romantic Etude, or whatnot. I don't think Beethoven would mind being placed in the classical category. But it's very interesting that someone who was his peer, Schubert, is placed in the romantic category on most of these lists.
Is he? So, why do you think that is? Does he have a certain shift in harmonic language or anything? You did say there's a tremendous overlap. So is there? He was just how much younger was Schubert? I mean, what age was Schubert? Because Beethoven's 1770, right? I think.
Yeah. So Schubert was 20-something years younger, which certainly would have something to do with it, because what he's hearing in his childhood is a bit different. He's hearing things right at the turn of the century. And so, yeah, I mean, the way he's a little freer with kind of shifting among different keys, and less of a here's your tonic, here's your dominant, and they're gonna duke it out, which is a pretty sort of broad summary of classical sonata form. And Schubert's less inclined to do that. But there are pieces where you may have difficulty telling the difference between, is this young Beethoven or is this young Schubert? I mean, unless you're an expert in the two composers, then that may be a
Right.
silly question. But I think a
Right.
sort of average musician listener. So
What now you Nicole, you've looked at also the 18th century, and do you Vienna is kind of its own bag, right? I mean, it's kind of like Naples in a way because it was a huge hotbed, and then later Paris was a hotbed of intense musical activity. I mean, for the romantic, like I mean, like there's the okay, so there's the Paris side, there's the German side. I absolutely love Schumann's music, and I also like the Paris, the people who worked in Paris as well. Um, if we just spend a little bit longer on Schubert, now Schubert is, I mean, there's Haydn was also in Haydn, Beethoven. That is there a certain style to Viennese romantic music versus like French, like Chopin and I mean, Chopin's Polish, but he worked a lot in France. So, is there a difference between those two types of nationalities?
that's probably something I would defer to the musicologists to really kind of dig into more specifically. But when I think of the French romantic music, I really think of a lot more opera in the influence with the French Grand Opera. Even though people like Bellini and Donizetti were obviously Italian, they were getting music performed in Paris. Chopin was a big fan of the opera. I mean, you can hear it, and he's writing basically bel canto for the piano. So I tend to think of opera a lot more when I think of France in the early 19th century. You know, more than I mean, certainly people were going and staging and seeing operas in Vienna as well, but you know, that's where Beethoven is, so we're all kind of living in Beethoven's shadow, and he was not an opera buff, or he struggled to write Fidelio. So
Hmm.
that was, you know, less significant in his output.
Right, right.
Um,
So we should start. I mean, maybe we could just talk about just generally about romantic, the characteristics. I know in music, general music class, you have romantic is emotional. Classic. They have all these. What you would typically get in the undergraduate class. Maybe we could expand on that. I mean, is now with you have the expert knowledge in composition and improvisation. What, with your eyes, what do you see that's unique about the 19th century versus the 18th century?
I think as we go, and again, this isn't like a line in the sand, but as we proceed out of the 18th century and into the 19th century, I think the structural tones of the galant schemata get longer and longer range in a lot of cases. Now, sometimes there is just a very obvious schema that is pretty short, you know, just as you would get in Scarlatti and Soled and all these people that pianists forget about. As in pianists' minds, we sort of go straight from high Baroque, J.S. Bach to Mozart, which is not how it actually went, but it's how it sort of looks on the repertoire lists.
Hey, what
So,
happened to
and people
CPE
like,
Bach? Yeah, CPE Bach
yeah,
disappears.
well, you go from Domenico Scarlatti and then Soled, you know, you see these schemata that are sort of contained and pretty short and easy to hear. And then I find just in a lot of the romantic music that I encounter and that my piano students encounter, they tend to be longer range. They tend to be a little more disguised with chromatic diminutions, you know, variations of stuffing. I tend to put a lot of food analogies into these things in lessons. So there may be different stuffing in the two voice frameworks. And so, and individual composers will tend to do this too. They'll start disguising the schemata more and more as they go. But, you know, it doesn't mean you're not going to find a Pulcinella in the Chopin barcarolle, because a student and I did.
Wow. Okay. So you were talking about the schema, and also I want to mention the book by Professor. Well, two books, of course, Music in the Galant Style, which is kind of popularized schema theory, but a book you've mentioned that you like to use a lot, which is Harmony, Counterpoint, and Partimento by Job Agerman. And did you just want to get people back? We talked a little bit about how you used it in the first interview, but for people who are just seeing this interview for the first time, talk about that book and how you kind of use it, because that book goes all the way to Brahms and it goes beyond like the 18th century.
Yeah, so it is meant to replace a college music theory textbook. So instead of doing your four-part harmony, you're working out of this book. And what he's doing is reorienting you so that you're thinking more in lines rather than in vertical stacks, which I think is so great for pianists who tend to be kind of stuck thinking vertically. And I was one. I mean, I'm a pack rat, and so I have all my like high school and college age compositions, and sometimes I'll just kind of go through them for a laugh, and there's just so much kind of vertical, just
Mm,
like plunk, 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 and then not so much of a line, that had to develop later.
right.
And so this book gets you really attuning to the lines, and he'll have you very zoomed out at first. You're just kind of filling in scales and thirds and sixths and kind of wondering what you're doing. But as I express to my students, imagine you're on Google Maps and you're zoomed so far out that all you see is green space. Then he has you zooming in so you start to see roads and landmarks and rivers and all that stuff. And then he gets you into the schemata that really kind of elaborate on these long range thirds and sixths.
Right.
And then he gets
Right.
you into the rule of the octave. He splits that up nicely. He doesn't get you into four-part writing until chapter 6, which I think is smart. You're doing Galant schemata in chapter 5. I mean, it's not an exhaustive study of schemata, but it gives students the idea of what they are. And then he's getting into chromatic harmony in chapters 8 and 9. So it's really a great book. It's one that I always thought should be written. I mean, writing a textbook is a huge undertaking. You can't just say, write the book yourself. It's
Yeah.
mostly you have to wish that other people are going to write that book, and I'm glad he did.
Oh, that's great. Should we look at some? Perhaps we should actually look at some examples now, just to kind of get the sound in. What do you think we should start with? I mean, there's so many schemas. Should we go by composer? Should we go by schema? What do you think, Nicole? How should we start this out?
Well, we could do, let's start with the schema, and just because I have one sort of on the brain from last night from a student I was working with. He's doing the Bach Prelude and Fugue in E minor from Well Tempo Clavier 1, which is a very fun one. And if you hear me typing, it's just because I'm pulling up my PDFs as well. And so he's got the Prelude. It opens with actually a schema that is not in the Yerdingen,
Right.
as far as I can recall, but John Rice has defined it as the Lully, and John Mortensen has defined it as the page 1. So in the book, The Pianist's Guide to Historic Improvisation, which is it's a very, very good book, especially for pianists who are a little apprehensive about the idea of going into improvisation. It's a very gentle introduction. I think it's really great in that
Okay.
way. And so in that book 1, we've got, and so it opens with a pretty nice Lully in minor. And so the Lully that everybody knows is the book 1 C major prelude. So
Right.
people forget that it works in minor as well. Okay, so we're I should also probably mention that we're looking at the downbeats. Roughly the downbeats in measure 3, also that chord halfway through, which is the more typical chord that we get in the Lully, the 6/5, but goes on from there.
Right.
And then for something completely...
So just really quickly, if people were not familiar with schema theory, what is a luli? Just really briefly.
So it is a basically 4-part thing, framework, lick, schema, whatever you would like to call it, that goes. It's a 5/3, so I'm talking in figured bass here, over a scale degree 1, then some kind of 2 over a scale degree 1. A lot of times it's going to be a 4/2. It can also be 5/2, but 6/4/2 is probably what you're going to see in most of this stuff. And then generally goes to a 6/5 over scale degree 7. Or I'll take what Bach did in the soprano there. There's a few sopranos that work with this. And then we go back to our 5/3 over scale degree 1. So, of course, the example that everybody thinks of is... There's your 4/2. There's your 6/5. There's your 5/3.
Okay, got it. Okay.
So this is a popular opener, and so it's a very nice. It's one that I like to offer to students to start for figuration preludes, which that Well-Tempered Clavier Book 1 is completely a figuration prelude. People tend to enjoy and be familiar with that piece. So here's just another example from the Well-Tempered Clavier, and then, I like to say, and now something completely different is, and this was actually something that the other student had in his repertoire, so it worked out very well to kind of make that comparison.
What was it? Give me a chance to pull it up. What was it?
It was Mazeppa.
Oh, okay. Liszt.
Yeah.
Franz Liszt. Okay.
Yeah, and I went to the wrong page, so I'll have to...
It's okay.
It's, I know I don't have book, but this is just the IMSLP copy, so you just sort of... And then it's the second page of the etude. So there's this whole cadenza in the beginning, and then the actual theme starts. That's what I'm after.
All right.
Yeah, so scroll past all that. And then, this is the theme. Now, I'm not going to try and do the horse hoofs, because I have not studied this piece, but you don't need them. Actually, the schema is obvious in the outer voices.
Mm-hmm.
So, it just goes... Just a luli. Actually, very interesting soprano. He kind of marches down the scale. He kind of goes like...
Right. Yeah, and he is your prototypical, romantic composer, and it's right there the same. Now, how old is the luli? Bach, right? There you go. It's just right there in the Well-Tempered Clavier.
I'm sure it predates him. You'd have to ask the people who kind of dive into 17th century music. I think they would know.
Wow.
Sort of its origin.
There's like one whole continuum there, basically. People are still using these forms. And you can see it in the romantic. That's a great example.
Oh, yeah. So some of these Liszt pieces, because Liszt studied with Czerny, and there's actually a great little video on tone bass. I don't know if how much cross pollination there is between this channel and tone bass. I also blog for tone bass.
Okay.
So and there was a video on Yunchun Lim, the most recent Clyburn competition winner, and his interpretation of Fufole, which is the next etude in this set. He played the entire set for the semifinal round, which is just an ungodly feat. Right. And this video was kind of dissecting his interpretation, but part of what it did was pull up the very early versions of these etudes that he wrote when he was about 15. and
Mm.
actually went into some of the schemata used and the fact that he had studied with Czerny and how some of these early etudes really sound more like Schubert than this list that we know.
Right. Right.
And then Czerny, of course, connects to Beethoven. So everybody was kind of teaching everybody and kind of going down the family tree that way. And so it was a really great little study of Feu Follet in particular, which also, like, the Fenaroli becomes thematic in Feu Follet. I think it is the scariest Fenaroli in the literature.
Well,
I
okay.
have
Wait.
never
So
even
what?
attempted this piece.
It's right after. Is it 5 then?
Yeah.
It's 5. Actually, okay. Since I have the score open, I might as well look it up. So where does the Fenaroli happen?
So it's the thematic part when you get to, I would say, probably measure 31 is where it's less unclear
Oh,
than
goodness.
it would be otherwise. However, in this case, it does help to have
Mhm.
the Kitty etudes, and Ben has sort of dissected it in this video that he made, about the performance.
Yep.
And especially because the right hand has so many diminutions. I mean, look at all those diminutions.
Yeah.
I mean, it is just.
No,
But
that's a good segue, into diminutions of the 19th century. So, how do they use diminutions in the 19th century? That's different because you have tons of notes in the 18th century as well. But like, what's different about it? I mean, is there more chromatic notes?
yeah, pretty much just denser. As sort of piano technique improved, and pianos got more powerful, people were kind of finding these ways to just write more and more challenging music that would just captivate audiences. Obviously, people like spectacle. I don't think that's changed. And so, yeah, there'll be more diminutions, denser, stuffing inside the two voice frameworks. I mean, I don't know what Bach would think of this. I mean, Bach certainly knew the Fenaroli. So we've got the A minor invention, which Agerman uses as an example. But I don't know what he would have made of this.
So we talked about Liszt a little bit. You want to just spend a little bit more on Liszt, what your impressions are of his piano writing and how it's like, what do you think about his use of schema as well?
Yeah, he can be very clear with his use of schema, but what he's doing is innovating in terms of texture, so the diminutions. I mean, I don't think you're going to see any of this kind of thing in the 18th century. I mean, I cannot play this at tempo. I've never studied this piece, but
You can do it, Nicole. You can do anything.
It's about 10 times that tempo. It looks like a very different Fenaroli from, which I kind of leaned on each of the notes to kind of make it clearer.
Yeah. And that's the A minor invention, right? I mean,
the two-part invention.
Great piece. That's a great piece as well. Those inventions are fantastic. But I feel like we talk about Bach and we get sucked right back into the 18th century, which is a good thing, of course.
Well, just because there's not as much that line in the sand as piano students think there is, and
yeah.
If you're thinking of, well, what's new in the 19th century, I always tend to default to the answer, nothing is truly new, because Bach probably did it. It's just more commonplace in the 19th century. This is not going to be something that just started being used in the 19th century, because if you look hard enough, you can find examples in the 18th century, but it is much more commonplace to have chromatic third long-range key relationships. I mean, the example I think of is Schubert's Shepherd on the Rock. Again, said, why do we call Schubert romantic, but we call Beethoven classical? And they overlapped almost completely in their lifetimes. But Schubert will go from B flat, and then he'll just let that common tone hang there, and he's like, okay, F sharp major, or G flat. I can't even remember how he writes it. And then he takes that F sharp or G flat or whatever you want to call it, and then he lets it hang there, and then he's okay, D major. And okay, our new common tone is D, and then he goes back to B flat. kind of over the course of the piece. And that's not something you're going to see most 18th century composers attempting.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that that's it. He was a genius, wasn't he? Now, but kind of he's unique. Would you say that he was pushing the boundaries more than people around that his contemporaries at his time?
Well, I think he had a different idea of how one could move around among keys, and he wasn't necessarily interested in having two keys fighting. He more liked to float around, which is an idea that's been around in music theory land. Just kind of exploring different key areas rather than Beethoven kind of creating this high drama, which is also great. It's just different.
Yeah.
But Beethoven could dramatize a ponte like nobody else. This dominant pedal, which is what a ponte is, before you get to the recapitulation in a sonata form, you're not really going to see Schubert being very interested in that.
Okay,
Yeah.
so let's get back to schema. I was really enjoying your examples of the schema. Maybe what else should we talk about? I'm also, we haven't talked about certain other composers too. I mean, Mendelssohn is a
Mendelssohn
great
and
composer.
Chopin, and of course, I completely didn't realize that Chopin's birthday is today, the day that we are shooting this.
Yeah,
So,
that's right.
Maybe I
That's
should be looking at a couple of the examples that I like in the G minor ballade.
Let's make this a special Chopin episode. Of course, when this airs, it'll be like, I don't know, at a different day. But just so everyone knows, this was shot on Chopin's birthday.
Yeah,
Very
well,
auspicious, huh?
Now I'm poking my iPad screen trying to pull up the menu again, just because I had a day of panic at my church gig where I was trying to grab the annotate menu, and then some recently played menu came up instead, and then, I've had this iPad for like 3 years, and I am just useless when it comes to Apple devices, so of course...
We just got an iPad recently, too. By the way, Nicole, what's the best, iPad app that a professional pianist should have?
Oh, absolutely the score reading app. So it's FORSCORE. It's the gold standard for iPad music apps. I mean, it is a big reason I went for the iPad rather than like an Android tablet. Also, there were some teaching apps that I wanted access to that are iOS only. As I have a PC, my phone is an Android. I just didn't have iOS access. My fiance, on the other hand, he would buy a cardboard box if it had the Apple logo on it. So he has everything.
So this app is great for gigs. It's great for teaching. It's great for everything, you're saying.
Yeah, so you can annotate really powerfully. I have some customized highlighter and pen colors to mark different things. Like if I want to use the middle pedal, the sostenuto pedal, in an orchestra reduction, because of course 99% of my piano performance is collaborative piano. And so I am dealing with reductions. Sometimes I need to just hold a note and do other things and hope that it doesn't turn into a soup. And so I have a different highlighter color I use to mark those pedalings. Or I'll highlight, if I'm playing a choral piece, like I put a little swipe of highlighter on the piano brace so my eye is drawn to the piano staff and not the parts.
Right.
So it's really powerful. I probably haven't tapped into half the features. You can also duplicate pages, so if you get those pop songs where you have to do like DS, alt coda, and then jump 5 pages ahead and then jump 3 pages back, and it's like a scavenger hunt every time you play, you can just duplicate those pages so you're only turning forward.
Wow, that's cool. That's really cool. That's very intelligent software design. So okay, so let's talk about Chopin because it's his birthday today. So I mean, I love the guy. I think he's a great composer. Was he we don't know, but did he use Partimento? I mean, we don't. Was he a basso continuo, or did he use Roman? I asked Professor Philip Tarita this, and he has he thinks his best guess is probably some kind of thorough bass basso continuo kind of orientation.
Yeah. So the person I would defer to on this is Helena Goldberg, who's a musicologist at IU, also an expert on Polish music. She is from Poland, and I believe she has some articles on this, but from my fuzzy memory of this is that it was based on Partimento concepts, but her name is just spelled just like the Goldberg Variations, and so you can find her and her work, and so she'll tell you all about it. And yeah, I mean, to me, it's very clear through his music that he was trained in this way. I mean, Roman numerals are an artifact of the 19th century, sort of after a lot of these composers we think of were trained. So the Roman numerals wouldn't really have anything to do with anything.
Oh, right, because Mendelssohn founded the Leipzig Conservatory, and all of that kind of really took off and skyrocketed in use. I mean, like 20, 30, 40 years after these people were working, I guess.
Yeah. And so it's really more of a thing for these liberal arts music, music appreciation, that these business majors take just because it sounds fun.
Yeah. But so you said, I found that very interesting. You're saying looking at the music, and I mean, I loved showing harpsichord, basso continuo musicians 19th century music, and they immediately start looking at the score and say, oh, this is that. Do you see this in a similar way? You see that it's kind of obvious, or rather it's very compelling that he would have known the sort of basso continuo partimento tradition.
Oh yeah. So yeah, one of my examples I like to use, so when we go in Aserman chapter 2, he has you doing 3-voice 7/6 chains, we're like, stuff like that. And sometimes at that point, students are still saying, well, where am I going to find such a nice example of this in the literature? And I pull up my Chopin ballades and I go to measure 36, and just the left hand is pretty much exactly. Now he kind of doubles back and then he skips a step, but I mean just the left hand, which I'm going to cheat and play with both hands. But
okay.
And then he skips one, and then he repeats it, and then. So
I think I found it. Is it this here? Okay.
Yeah. Whatever. Oh yeah, you don't have measure numbers.
Yeah. Yes. I'm
so
just
it's at the so yeah. Look at the tempo. Oh, that is interesting notation in the soprano. It is not quarter notes in my edition. I had to stare at that for a second.
I don't know what this is. I just pulled it up. I just grabbed something from my IMSLP. So that sort of like 7/6. And see, now I remember I used to put chord symbols on Chopin's etudes. I used to feel very smart about myself back in the day. But I feel like this is a little bit more useful for me, just to see kind of the way he might have thought. I know he studied counterpoint as well, quite seriously as well, in his training with maybe Elsner. And yeah, so like when you were playing it like that, can you play that again? That was very nice. That's very good. So now that we have the score up, maybe we can kind of look.
Yeah, and I'll also kind of pull your attention to the end of that first system where there is this is an example of stuffing the 2-voice framework with something else.
Yeah.
Instead of, which he could have just done that, but he's just giving it a little something extra, maybe something you wouldn't necessarily see as much in the 18th century, although, not that it wouldn't exist. I mean, as soon as you say something didn't exist, we'll find an example in which Bach did that thing. So.
Yeah.
But here we got, play from measure 36, so just the left hand. Really, the right hand almost doesn't even add to the progression. But here it is. Yeah, and it's the same
comes
thing.
Alive. With a little bit of insight, like that thing that we all just hear all the time. I mean, if we're familiar with, let's just take a minute to look at this and then just and it just kind of opens up. That's brilliant. That's a great example. In terms of the forms, the polonaises, the mazurkas, the nocturnes, obviously these forms didn't exist in the 18th century. John Field, of course, I think he took the nocturne from John Field.
Mhm.
So in terms of forms, that's different, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, Chopin again was a big opera buff, and in some of the nocturnes, I do feel like it's very much influenced by the bel canto aria, where it'll be kind of this rondo form, but then you'll have the increasing fioritura, so the just more diminutions in the soprano, because that's what the singers did to show themselves off. And then people kind of joke, well, he was the best bel canto composer. Too bad he hardly ever wrote for the voice.
Yeah,
And,
that's right. Yeah.
but I hear a lot of because I mean, I don't know how much we've talked about this, but I just had a piece accepted into an anthology of Chopin nocturne influenced pieces by women composers. It's called 22 Nocturnes for Chopin. It's for a project run by a recent graduate of the Royal Northern College of Music. I had a nocturne in G sharp minor that was accepted, and so while I was writing the piece, I was really kind of looking at the formal organization in some of the nocturnes. And now there was a stipulation that there was a maximum length, and I ended up deciding on a binary form because that fit within the stipulation that they wanted. And so, I found myself choosing a few nocturnes to kind of use as formal inspiration. And formally, I tend to take a more classical approach, just as if I'm composing and left to my own devices. But I saw a lot of these rondo forms that had the substantial variation within them. I think he also got that from Mozart. Does that a lot. So
yeah, that's very interesting. Now we can actually play a little bit. Should we play a little bit? Why don't we play a little bit, and then you can give some commentary.
Yeah, so this is the record. I know it says recorded by the composer. It was actually created by my Note Performer software, which is a plugin that I purchased to go with Sibelius.
Very good. Yeah.
And it's apparently run by AI, but it gives a much more lifelike sound than what's available in any of these notation programs. It supposedly works with any of them. Sibelius is my choice. It has been since 2001. But yeah, I can play a little bit of it. And
okay, let's play a little bit, and then you can just talk about the composition itself after we play maybe 30 seconds or so. Okay. I want to keep playing it. I don't want to stop it. It's very good. It's very hard for me to stop it. Okay, I would probably just play the whole thing. I have to stop it somewhere. It's so good. Nicole, that was great. What a composition. You are such a good composer. And I remember the first interview I complimented. Was it a quartet you wrote? I think a C minor something. That was very good too.
A string quartet in C major.
C major.
So that was performed at the She Scores Composition Festival and New Music Festival last year. So last summer, and then that was rebroadcast on WCLV, which is Cleveland's wonderful classical music station, back in the fall. So that was more of me attempting to be contemporary, which is not always something I'm comfortable with, clearly. But apparently the product was very well received. The players had a lot of fun with it. So I'm hoping this will be the same for the Nocturne. There's just not that much good Chopin preparatory music, because I think historical composition training that we get through Partimenti just hasn't kind of circulated
Hmm.
widely enough to be available to pedagogical composers yet.
Yeah.
But I think it is incredibly important for pedagogical composers, so composers of older style music for students of whatever instrument. Just extremely important to be fluent in schema and partimento and all that, because otherwise you will always be speaking the tonal language with an accent.
Wait, so okay, so it's interesting because I remember just at the beginning of this interview, you said you looked at your older compositions. Did this influence you greatly in terms of the way you kind of broke away from more vertical composing and thinking in a different kind of orientation?
Well, yeah, so in
Because I know you
2005,
didn't you study composition, I mean, before all of this as well?
yeah, so I was my degree from the University of Michigan is in theory. So I had all these grand plans of becoming the next Nadia Boulanger, and the theory degree they're kind of exceptional in that they have a theory degree at the undergrad level, which is
Hmm.
somewhat hard to find. Obviously, ample composition coursework is expected of that. And also, I had just the absolute stroke of luck to be able to enroll in the upper level counterpoint course in
Hmm.
2005, which was earlier than I normally would have been allowed to, but I had some shuffling around. I was able to finish my coursework kind of early, and Kevin Corson was teaching it. So he
Hmm.
is another big name in teaching
Right.
with a partimento approach, and he would give us some of the Princess Anne partimenti from Handel. I had no idea what they were at the time. We would just get this bass and say, fill it out, and we would do it. And, I wasn't aware that that's what they were called. But that class really sort of forced me to start thinking in lines rather than just, here's some chords and a pretty melody,
Hmm. Hmm.
which
Yeah.
was, I mean, I think that's how a lot of pianists, composers start to go about it. If they have a sense of melody, they might have a pretty melody. And then from there on, it's just chord, chord, chord.
Now, how do I get to write like you? I mean, that's so good. I mean, what do I have to? You said fluency and schema. What else do I need to do? Can you write out that? What's the steps that a beginning? If you could do over composition training, maybe not for yourself, but maybe for your student. How do you plan it out? Like, what kind of things do you have to sketch out a path for in terms to compose nicely like this?
I mean, really making sure. Well, if we're talking about kids, you have to make sure the parents are on board with supporting practice every single day. Get the student playing a wide variety of repertoire.
Okay.
So, playing, not just listening. I mean, listening is nice, but especially for certain learning styles, they need to
Mm,
be seeing and doing it as well. And that's what
yeah.
these conservatories in Italy were doing because they were immersed in it. They were in mass every day. They were
Yeah.
playing and singing and writing every day. Now, that's hard to do today because classical music is no longer the popular music. So it's not what is sort of in your face every day. Again, that's why I think there is an advantage if the parent is a musician because then there's that daily interaction with that type of music. But a wide variety of repertoire, all the exam people are going to get angry at me for saying this, but the
Make them
exam culture
angry.
of playing 3 pieces a year just because that's all you have time to
No,
prepare for your exams
that
is a
doesn't cut it.
big problem.
Yeah.
So some teachers are good about this where they won't keep you on only your exam pieces. They'll have you playing 20 pieces a year and then you'll pick your 3 for the exam. But I find a lot of exam focused studios are just 3 pieces a year. And then I'll get these adult students who come in and they did Royal Conservatory their whole lives and they've never done Debussy. And so
Oh, you're
their
preaching.
vocabulary
This
is
is
just
like a
missing so
tonic.
much.
This is like a tonic to the soul. What you're just saying, because like, I know what you're saying. Exam, because for anyone who's listening from maybe where I'm from, Singapore, India, Australia, Canada, the British colonies, we have, and I know there's some people within the system who are trying to reform and introduce more creative elements. I really applaud that work, but it's true if you spend 6 months and playing just the same pieces. First of all, your neighbor is going to complain. That's going to be the first thing. No, I'm not joking. There was a story in Singapore where one neighbor had to call the police because they said, yeah, my neighbor was playing the same song for hours and hours for weeks or months or something, and we we memorized the song. They were saying this is a real
I
thing.
mean, geez, at that point, I would just say, take a look at your practice techniques. You're practicing inefficiently. I mean, Chopin used to say you shouldn't need more
I have
than
to
3
bring that
hours a
news
day
on.
unless you're, overcommitted. You took on too
Yes.
many collaborative projects, or you're just being inefficient with your practice. So I tend to agree with Chopin there. Speaking of our birthday boy.
Exactly. And I think I found that there was he took that from Hummel. Do you know much about Hummel, Nicole?
Mostly just that little echo space that was in the Suzuki books that I that's like something like that. And then you sort of forget about him until you trace all the pedagogical lineages.
Yeah.
Piano repertoire land, that's another gap because pianists forget that the galant existed. Then they also forget that the brilliant style existed. Sometimes they may play Mendelssohn songs without words when their hands are too small to be playing Brahms. But all these like Hummel, Czerny, these people, I think Dussek probably fits in there as well, but all these people in the brilliant style, Weber. I mean, you're not playing Weber unless you have huge hands, but also brilliant style. So that's another gap in the piano repertoire list. That is...
I found the article by the woman going crazy over daily piano sounds. So I thought it was quite nice to hear piano music coming from her neighbor. Then about 6 months later, her next door neighbor began playing the same song daily between 7 a.m. and 11 p.m.
7 a.m. And I don't get those people who can practice at that hour of the day and like their brains are actually working. I mean,
no,
but
I
have my online studio is like it's pretty wide ranging because I teach students in so many time zones. But okay, maybe 8:30 a.m. and then I may have a student at 5 or 6 p.m. But it's on and off, and then it's mostly they're playing. I'm really not playing all that much. But if I were the neighbor, I think I would give them a talking to about the way they're spending their practice time.
Well, Nicole, this time, look at that. I mean, it's just flying. Okay, maybe we should just to end off. Did we miss anything important about a romantic piano literature or piano partimento styling, or just this whole theme that we're talking about? Any big things that we should touch on for the end?
I
wanted to talk about pedaling as well, if we had a chance to, with the piano pedal.
Yeah, I mean, as I've noted to many a student, pedaling depends so much on the room and the instrument. I discovered how much I was over pedaling when I got this piano. Now, my home is all hardwood. This piano is probably too large for the space. I mean, there's a whole story involved in how we acquired the piano. And I had spent so many years practicing in IU's practice rooms, which are these soundproof little boxes that are cobbled together into a building. And what happens in there is that you start pedaling for resonance because it is so dead in there. And then I got in here and I realized how much I was just over pedaling and turning everything into a soup. And so now I have to be a lot more careful about pedaling in here because
what's the trick to pedaling?
It really depends on the room and the piano and the repertoire. There isn't really any one trick, which I know people want the clickbait trick. So it's really to see how responsive your piano is. This piano is exquisitely sensitive to pedaling, which I've had to learn to work with it because it also sits high. It's on wheels and casters. So the pedals are maybe a good inch higher than they would be, if they weren't on wheels and casters. So I've had to be careful not to let my foot really come down hard on it. I have to pedal a little less. Now, speaking of Chopin, I ran across an article where people talked about that he would just flutter pedal constantly. I mean, I think my calves would absolutely die if I tried to do that on this piano. But what his friends reported was that his flutter pedaling would give this sort of halo to the sound.
A little reverb.
And again, he's got, he has older instruments. I don't know what kind of room he was in. If it was upholstered, if it was not, I imagine it was probably hardwood. I mean, what else did they use back then?
Yeah.
but it would also depend on the space. Of course, recording the piano is just absurdly difficult. I've done quite a bit of recording with a friend here in town, and just the amount of engineering that goes into it is just
Mm,
beyond my imagination. So
right.
there
Right.
really are so many factors that go into how particular pedaling will sound. That's why we have to get used to so many instruments.
Okay.
Well, we can't carry our pianos around, but we have to spend time with each instrument in space to get a feel
Mm.
for it. Um,
Now, I know I interrupted you as you were about to tell me about what you said, the just important things that we missed about, or just wanted to mention about 19th century piano, partimento, and that sort of thing.
yeah, I mean, just like listening suggestions that I would give. I would really recommend diving into the Mendelssohn songs without words. I do think Mendelssohn is probably the closest we have to a successor to Mozart in that sort of brilliant style, early romantic kind of writing. Um, and Goethe had the pleasure of, I guess, meeting both Mozart and Mendelssohn as children, and he was able to make
That's
a direct
crazy.
comparison.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's crazy that people lived that long back then. So I really recommend the Songs Without Words. There's just a huge book of them, and they're really approachable, for schema analysis and just as wonderful music as well. I'm also going to suggest Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel.
Mm,
She's listed alternately as Mendelssohn and Hensel, as her married name. Felix's older sister, who was equally gifted. It obviously sort of had her life pulled in other ways, and couldn't compose quite as much, but another person who grew up in that atmosphere and would be another very approachable introduction to that language. I would also suggest listening to as many Bellini and Donizetti arias as possible. And these are the source
mm.
material for Chopin. Um, so I'm always putting together opera listening lists for my piano students, because I don't want to say specialty, because I wouldn't call myself a specialist. There's just too much repertoire for me to do that at the moment. But what I spend most of my collaborative piano time on is the vocal repertoire. So
Mm.
bel canto arias, Handel and Mozart arias, all that stuff. Especially that stuff is really good for young singers, because you don't need to have a Wagnerian voice, to sing all that stuff. And so
Can I
that's
ask you?
really
No, you just said. I sorry to interrupt you, but it made me want to ask you a thing, which is, well, two questions now that I now remember the other question, which is the first thing is being an accompanist. Now, most pianists are just solo heroes. They're just, there's just a lot of people just play solo repertoire. I feel like this sort of that's like something that they would have done a lot in the 19th century, in the 18th century. That was like part of being a pianist, part of that whole. So, what insights can you have you gained from doing that, that has informed just piano playing in general, and everything, looking at the repertoire and just the way accompanying a voice? What are some nice insights from that?
um absolutely just the need to keep going and support what is going on around you, which is really something that partimento study helps with. Let's say you have to play in someone's lesson and it's a Handel rage aria that is extremely technical, and it's not realistic for you to sight read that note for note, but if you recognize the schemata, if you know your rule of the octave, if you see what's happening given the bass line, even if it's an obbligato aria and it's not, he doesn't just give you continuo as he does sometimes, you can create something that's supportive enough to the singer that the lesson can still happen.
Hmm.
And then it's a much more successful musical experience for both of you. And then obviously partimento training informs improvisation, like cadenzas, Eingänge, things like that, where you're expected to improvise in a concerto. Or if there's a situation where you and your partner get off. I once accompanied an audition where the singer jumped 2 lines in her Mozart aria, and I was effectively sight reading, and I had to find her and sound musically plausible while I was finding her.
Yeah.
And stuff like this happens all the time. And I find a lot of piano students who don't grow up with partimento and improvisation are just trained to follow what's on the page, or there may be other sociological reasons for that where they're taught to obey everyone around them. But partimento study and schema study and accompanying will teach you it's okay. You don't have to do what's on the page all the time. You can't when it's an orchestra reduction. That's why I have my accessible accompaniments, the playable aria reductions. They're sort of ready-made for sight reading situations. You know, I had to play the Schumann Opus 73, so it's the Fantasiestucke. I had the kind of rare opportunity to play the complete set with a clarinetist for a church that I play services with frequently, and they really appreciate high-quality music, so they got a clarinetist who had subbed with the Cleveland Orchestra, and we performed these together. And there was a little arpeggio passage in the last movement where it was just way too big for my hand. I do have a very small hand, and so I had no hesitation about just revoicing that. And because I know partimento, I know counterpoint, I know how these lines are functioning. So I revoiced it in a way that would fit my hand without sounding like a clunky mess. And keeping in mind what the clarinet was doing and how the lines were all interacting, went over perfectly. I mean, certainly people at a church gig, I'm not sure how many of them even know who Schumann was, but musically it was completely intact. And I don't think a pianist who is trained to follow everything that's on the page would necessarily have thought of that option. They would probably be drilling this passage that didn't fit their hand from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. and maybe calls the cops on them. Now in a competition situation, you are often stuck with judges who are going to say, why didn't you play exactly what was on the page? But I think it's because those judges aren't necessarily all trained in this stuff.
Yeah,
But
so that's I have a question about that, which is, is this pressure more on the singer or the accompanist, or really it's a tag team, both? It's equal pressure for both people. Like if you don't play exactly the same thing, is it okay? Is it so stressful?
I think it's much easier to sell that in the collaborative literature than in the solo literature. Because it really is like you, 2 or 3 or 4 people, or however many people are coming together to form a product or to form a whole. And so, it's hard to say because I turned to collaborative arts, when I started PhD theory coursework at Indiana, I was kind of looking for a way to keep making music, and I no longer had an ensemble requirement to be in choir, and then the non-major voice TAs sort of snapped me up. So I pretty much made a pretty clean break from focusing on solo repertoire. And so there was a lot of this, you need to kind of rework the accompaniments on the fly, because a lot of them were singing musical theater and pop where it's like they'll duplicate the vocal line in the piano part, and that's not what you should be playing.
Just the harmony, okay.
So I was in these situations where I had to kind of change things on the fly, and it's just like being a continual player.
Right. Now, Nicole, are you ever in this situation? Now, I'm not. You have much more experience with this with me, but if you're accompanying a lesson, do you have to ever deal with a character like this? Like who's just kind of a singing teacher who's going crazy and very. This is from Citizen Kane, but I was just thinking, do you have to deal with pretty crazy singing teachers who are kind of over the top?
Oh goodness, I mean. Yes, I'd say a lot of singing teachers are over the top. It's always been in a good way.
Yeah.
I've had the great privilege of working with some incredibly famous and effective voice professors. Of course, that IU is world famous for its opera program, and justifiably so. And so one of my favorite people I've worked with long term was Wolfgang Brendel. He's a Wagnerian baritone. Teaches a lot of baritones, so I played a lot of that literature. I mean, he is hilarious, and his way of teaching German diction was telling the singer what sort of silly or potentially dirty thing they accidentally said in German because their vowel wasn't quite right.
Oh.
We would just be like, just falling over laughing, and that corrected their diction very quickly.
Right, right.
Or,
You knew
you
what they were
know,
actually saying.
Carol Vanessa might join you in a duet from Rigoletto, and, you know, she can still bust out those high C's as Gilda. And, you know, and her little dog is trying to get up in my lap at the piano. She's got this little, like, rat terrier. And, just
Right, right.
such great characters. I mean,
I think that
uh,
that's what's missing from like most pianists, because most pianists are in their own bubble and they all want to be great and they all want to be virtuoso. And it's just that path to the piano competition. I feel like this is more, I more normal, more balanced. It kind of weaves together history, it weaves together all kinds of repertoire, and I think more people should explore at least accompaniment and ensemble playing. I think that's a very good thing. Now, big question I forgot to ask you. This is a very big one, and I like to
mhm.
ask people this question, which is being a composer, being an improviser, knowing partimento, has that changed how you play repertoire?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just with the aforementioned freedom to alter things that are detracting from the musical product. In that particular case, the arpeggio, the way it was voiced at the end of the Schumann Opus 73, that was just completely a poor fit for my hand size. Of course, Clara had very large hands. You can see them in photos of her. So
Hmm.
I looked at that, and after the first couple times, I said, you know, this is just not something that works for my hand size. And I had the freedom to go there and revoice it in a way that was true to Schumann's musical intentions and still sounded like a coherent musical whole, because then I speak that tonal language.
Hmm. Right.
And so I was able to do that. Or I've had, especially in orchestral reductions. I mean, goodness, this is a whole art among accompanists, changing what is on the page to make it sound like the orchestra and be playable. And I mean, that's why I started the accessible accompaniments, because I knew singers would be in these situations where they just had to hand a score to an audition pianist who may or may not know that aria. And it would always be dicey to figure out what are they going to play, especially if it's Strauss, you know, or some of these very thick or very poorly made reductions. And so it was actually the first one I did was the composer aria from Ariadne of Naxos, which is a very messy reduction, but it can be reduced down and be pretty playable. And it was for a student of Patricia Stiles, who's a mezzo, who sang that role. And so, you know, seeing that endorsement from her kind of inspired me to continue, and now I have, you know, a growing catalog of these, even some performing auditions and some audition cuts where, you know, it might almost be an aria, but there are a few other people, you know, that you can't account for in an audition or solo recital, and so I've started doing the audition cuts.
Hmm.
And but really, I think my life as a composer, improviser, partimento practitioner really equipped me well to start creating these. And so I've heard they've saved a lot of behinds, and I mean, including
Great.
my own.
Okay, before we end off, maybe we should just mention Brahms. Oh, and can you talk about Grieg too? Are you familiar with his work? Do you play Grieg and Brahms?
Um, Admittedly, I have not played that much Grieg. Occasionally, you know, a couple lyric pieces for church gig preludes and postludes. I mean, you've got the concerto, which people sort of, sometimes I'll use that opening from the A minor concerto. It's an
Hmm.
elaborated hearts, which is another John Rice sort of definition, but this sort of the 5 3 6 4 5 3 over a one pedal, and then, you know, you get this. I guess it's just two of them.
Hmm.
That's the one example from Grieg that tends to sort of find its way into my studio. Um,
Great, great. And what about Brahms? We didn't talk
uh,
much about him.
yeah, so he's an interesting one, because he's often going even earlier than sort of the common practice in terms of his source material. He was very into earlier music like Palestrina and the like. And so, but I played the Opus 120, and I'll say the first movement of the Opus 120 number 2, which is the clarinet sonata. It has sort of this notorious passage in the first movement. So any of these collaborative pianists will sort of
Hmm.
shudder when I mention that. Um, but there are, you can find some of these schemata and these multi in these. Of course, he also wrote variations on common practice music, like the Handel variations, and
Hmm.
so things like that. Um, I think one could argue that V Melodian has the hearts in that. That's one of those that's it's in my long list of examples. It's not necessarily the first one I go to because I think others are clearer, but
Right.
um, but yeah, he's also not someone I perform as much because the hand size becomes a problem. But I
Hmm.
did that Opus 120 number 2 was with a friend for a performance proficiency at IU, and
Right. Right.
but
There's
he's yeah, I mean, that could probably be its own study. So
right. I know that Rachmaninoff is was in the 20th century, and so was Debussy. But I kind of feel, in many ways, they're also quite romantic, and part of that long 18th century. So, like, what do you think about their music as well? Pianists like Rachmaninoff, they like Tchaikovsky as well.
oh
What do you
yeah,
make
I
of
mean
those?
WC, I use that arabesque that sort of everybody plays. It's full bourdon, so like then if you kind of freeze it each way, it's just And I think that's in the Agerman book. Actually, I'm not going to claim that I discovered that on
Hmm.
my own. There's also one of the Ariets Oubliées, and all you French speakers can correct or be horrified at my
Oh
pronunciation, but
no, I'm
there
the
is a
worst at
very clear,
pronunciation.
there is a blatantly obvious, he's beating you over the head with it, Romanesca,
Hmm.
in one of the Ariets Oubliées, Cheval de Bois. Um, so he knew all this. I mean, he was in Paris.
Yeah,
I mean, Bob Yerdigan
people
has
people
already done this.
say
He's already he's forged that connection between Italy and Paris. So
no,
I
they make
probably
it
don't need to
seem
do
like
that again.
Debussy is like an alien because because of his later works, that therefore it repudiates all his past training, and he's completely harmonically in a different soundscape. But he knew, like, I really believe that, like you were saying with some of these examples, he would have been totally at home. I mean, how do you go through the Paris Conservatory and not know your basse chiffre, or that sort
Oh
of thing?
yeah, I mean, as I think people say this in many fields, you have to know the rules in order to break them effectively.
Exactly. Yeah,
And so he
I
knew the
totally
rules,
agree.
and then gave him more freedom to break them because he knew exactly what he was doing, and he wasn't just kind of putting notes on a page. I mean, and sometimes just kind of experimenting on your own is good, but I've adjudicated these composition contests where it was pretty clearly someone was just kind of improvising and then engraved it. Um, but those improvisations take on a lot more shape and purpose when you know the rules and then if you're choosing to break them.
Okay. Okay. And I get let's end off with this let's end off. We've been ending off for the last 30
This
minutes. So
is an
uh
Italian goodbye.
yeah.
Are you secretly Italian?
No, the thing is, people would say Partimento, great, Partimento, wonderful, I like it, good for the 18th century. But would you say that it is, you have, but maybe we can rubber stamp it. Is it useful to learn the 18th century first before going to the 19th century, or maybe you should just play the 19th century and go straight into the 19th century? What would you say to that?
Well, the materials I use with students are necessarily mostly 18th century. So, but I'll bring in examples from the 19th century. As soon as they're doing those chapter 2 examples in Aserman, I will pull up that Chopin Ballade example. But there's also a Handel bit from Rodelinda that is like a copy paste job from another example in chapter 2. I don't remember the number, but it goes like this. And then it was on the radio. I think this I got the serious trial for 3 months, and I never pay for it beyond that because WCLV is so good. But they had this Handel aria, and I was like, wait, that's that example. And then I went and
Hmm.
dug it up. And so
Yeah.
I'm bringing in examples from all over the common practice, depending on what the students' interests are, especially because I have students who are clearly like, I want to write romantic music. So they'll be doing both at the same time, or I'll say, take one of the slower partimenti from Fenaroli and then transcribe it, but only as a pitch pattern. Don't use any durations, just note heads. And then you can see the outline of kind of what's happening, and they put down the figures if there are figures. But then they can feel much more freedom with the diminutions. So instead of like, I might have instead of seeing all those eighth notes, which is going to make them think it's going to be a Baroque example, I might go like, and something like Bellini. Something like that, where they're like, they're just doing it more long range, and then they're, taking diminutions that they would use in a more romantic context. So that's a trick I like to use. Just retranscribe those basses as pitch patterns. Now, so they're not looking at eighth notes.
What do people say when they say that dissonances are not prepared in the 19th century? What does that mean?
It means you can just kind of jump onto a seventh and no one's going to come after you for it. I mean, Schumann loved this, and so I tend to be very tolerant of that myself. I joke that if left to my own devices, I would just write bel canto all the time. I think the Nocturne probably makes that clear. My Venturing Beyond set makes that clear. So that's my intermediate pieces they were intended for my adult students, but really they could be for any age, and they're in unusual keys. And that's kind of my natural habitat. I mean, there's some 18th century stuff in there, but a lot of it is kind of early 19th century.
That's a good place to end off, which is your work. And I really want to highlight your website. Here's your website. Definitely. Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, here's the website. So here you can find.
This is my artist website, and there's also a portal on here where you can purchase sheet music. So I have a separate studio website.
Okay. So here you can purchase the sheet music.
Yeah, that left column. So if you scroll, it says my studio website, and
here's Venturing Beyond.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the set.
Okay.
And then the pieces are available individually, but it's half the price if you just get the whole book. So.
Right. I mean, if it's anything like that, in the vein of that Nocturne, I mean, we can tell you're a great composer. Now, here's the artist website. Okay.
Yeah. So this is the studio website. So if you're interested in studying piano composition partimento, or more traditional college music theory,
if you're a listener, do it right now. I mean, I've had some people email me and said, Nikhil, thank you for helping me with discovering partimento, and I'm taking lessons with Nicole DiPaolo, and I'm loving it. That's a real story. Absolutely. So I mean, that's a real, and I know Nicola Cazzano endorses you, and you're definitely a great teacher. So certainly, I think if you're interested in partimento, Nicole is someone you can definitely check out. Sorry, I interrupted you. You were saying something.
No, so this is the studio site. I just gave up on trying to combine the two at some point. It just needed to be
WordPress, Nicole, WordPress.
Oh, man. I used to know a little HTML 20 years ago, and it's just incredibly out of date now. And so I just sort of gave up and went with Weebly. They can make you a very pretty website for free.
Yep.
So
okay.
I can change like a color tag. I still do that.
So if people want to study partimento, they can come to you. Composition, and so what are the common kind of lessons that you normally teach? Is it piano, composition, partimento, and accompaniment?
Yeah. So piano. Yeah. I mean, a lot of my students are just interested in studying the piano. A lot of times they need technique rehab. Or, they quit as kids and they want to pick it up again as adults. So I specialize in teens and adults. Online sort of works for the older student, kind of more ideally. And so then I also teach modern composition. So it doesn't necessarily have to be historical composition, although I'll bring in exercises sometimes. But then I, of course, have the Partimento cohort. So these people are interested in common practice composition. I'll also get college music theory students who either need extra reinforcement or they are preparing for graduate entrance exams. And
Great.
maybe they haven't had theory in a few years or their theory training wasn't very in depth. So in the summers, especially, I'm teaching more of those. Also, pianists who are looking to get into collaborative piano skills, coaching on their collaborative repertoire. I try to integrate those skills into piano lessons, but since I am fully online, it's a little harder to kind of jump in and say, "Hey, go play this trio with your piano trio." But I'll have students who will say, "Yeah, I'm playing this Dvorak sonatina with my friend who's a violinist," and then the violinist will come for a lesson, and then I'll coach them. And so that's been really great when I've had the chance to do that.
Wonderful. The great Nicole DiPaolo, definitely an esteemed member, as the great Giorgio Sanguinetti says, an esteemed member of this Partimento community, and really a legit teacher, legit player, composer. Thank you so much for existing and then contributing to this desperate struggle to teach music again in the historical way, which I think is very sorely needed in this world. And we really lack teachers. I mean, we don't have enough teachers. And so thank you for everything. Thank you for being on the show. Nicole, thank you so much. Come back again soon. We need to have a panel interview. I would love to have you talk. We would love to have more panel interviews, and I'd love to have you as a panelist. The great Nicole DiPaolo. Thank you so much, Nicole. Talk to you soon.
Well, thank you. Thank you again.